Hi, everybody. You're very welcome. So, this little section is looking at the cultural understandings of sustainability and what we mean by that. So, let's start with this observation. Very often, there's a simple temptation to think that sustainability is all about a technical adjustment. It's all about tweaking the system, amending certain aspects of it, reforming it in a kind of a way. And then when we do that, we will be able to get everyone to start behaving in a sustainable way. There may be an element of truth in that certain small reforms may bring about relatively big changes. But the problem we have in addressing this question of sustainability is far deeper. Any system, whatever that is, economic, political system, produces human subjects who are socialized within it. And those subjects think within the logic of that system. So it's what we call the subjectivity of the system. So in our system, our free market capitalism, human beings are socialized to think of themselves as individuals who are self-interested primarily and are rational. Economics, if you were to study economics as a social science, is entirely predicated on this assumption. It assumes that all the economic actors, all the human beings who behave within an economy are self-interested, so they do what's in their own best interest. They're rational in that they know what's in their best interest versus what isn't in their best interest, and they can therefore choose what's in their best interest. And they're individuals. So they think primarily as individuals. So I'm competing against you. I'm seeking to have more resources than you. If I can buy this compared to you buying it, then that's what I'm going to do. So people begin to think of themselves in these terms. They think I'm competing against other people. I'm primarily an individual. I'm rational in the sense I'll always select what's in my personal interest. And I will behave accordingly. This is within the logic of the system. I will do whatever brings about these benefits for me. So this is a subjectivity which we have because we are belonging to that Western paradigm of capitalism. So we think that it is normal and natural in some way to be like this and to behave in this way. But if we step back and have a more anthropological perspective, in other words, if we start looking at all human cultures over time, so since the beginnings of our records about human cultures, and over space, in other words, if we look at all the cultures even currently in the world, then we'll quickly see that this particular picture of how it is to be human is actually a tiny minority and very exceptional. And in very, very few cultures, indeed very few, have people behaved in this individualistic and self-interested way. In fact, on the contrary, it is more natural and normal for human beings to behave in a collective way, to cooperate with each other, to share resources with each other, to support and facilitate each other, to provide care for each other, to look after each other when they are ill. In other words, it's actually more natural for human beings to sacrifice for each other than to accumulate at the cost of each other. So we happen to live in a system that favors accumulation rather than sharing and sacrifice. That's nothing to do with our morality or whether we're good or bad compared to other people's. It really just has to do with the system in which we live, which is socializing us to behave in this kind of a way. Now, this doesn't just happen. So therefore, we need to think about, well, why did we end up with this kind of system producing this kind of behavior? We need to ask that question because we're all the time in these courses trying to think about how do we move into a more sustainable way of living? And if everyone behaves as a self-interested, self-accumulating, rational actor, then we're going to have a big problem trying to get those people to start thinking and living sustainably. So the Western picture is made up of a whole bunch of features. One of them would be that it's humanistic, In other words, it is based on the notion that the most valuable beings are human beings, and that what is in the best interest of human beings is what should always be done. So human beings come first. Human interest comes first. It also assumes that a key element of what it is to be human is to be as free as possible, which means you can make any decisions you want, and you can also meet your desires if possible. There should be no limit to your freedom, and there should be no limit to your desires. Indeed, again, our system is based on maximizing human desire. The more desires I have, the more things I want. The more things I want, the more things I buy. The more things I buy, the greater the economic growth. And the greater the economic growth, the better our system functions. But as we've known from other blocks, economic growth is at the core of the massive dysfunction that our system is causing at the level of sustainability by producing both inequality and ecological breakdown. But this is where all of this comes from, this notion that human desire and human freedom are absolute values that should be deeply respected and implemented as far as possible. So this is sometimes called anthropocentrism, where we put human beings at the very center. Anthropocentrism comes from anthropos, which is the Greek word for human, and then centric at the center. So humans are at the center, and everything should serve humans. So I want to build a wooden ship. So to do that, I just cut down a load of trees. That makes perfect sense because I want a wooden ship. I want to build a wooden fort. Again, I cut down loads of trees. The idea that the trees are alive, that they have an interest, that I should respect them in some way, well, that may be, but compared to human interest, that's largely an irrelevance. Human interest will always come first. We want to build a road because it will increase travel time or increase safety for human beings driving around in cars, so we therefore do it. The idea that a road may destroy large amounts of natural habitat, may have huge resource implications in terms of pollution and so on and so forth, both in building the road and then having more cars travel on the road. Again, while we can acknowledge this, human convenience and human benefit suggest that we do it because, after all, it is humans who are the most important life form. And what's in human interest is what we should generally do. The cultural barrier that we have to sustainability is enormous because it involves thinking outside of this framework, thinking outside of human superiority, and beginning to think of human beings in an ecological way, which is very difficult for Western human beings who are socialized in this very strong individualist model. The reality is, as we've come to understand ecological sciences, systems theory, and so on, is human beings are thoroughly integrated into all that is. There isn't humans and an environment as though it's something external to us. We are utterly integrated into the totality of being. The oxygen that we're breathing in our lungs, we don't generate it. It comes to us from trees. We breathe it into us. It goes into every one of our cells and animates our body. This is a tree component in us. Our digestive system is made up of microbes that aren't human at all, but bacteria, other life forms. They simply live in us, but they're completely distinct from us, and yet they're key determinants of our health and well-being, both physical and mental. The colors which we see through our eyes are all external to us, that come into our brains through our eyes and are processed and turned into color, but they're coming from the outside in. In fact, our whole world is made up of influences from the outside in. And we are inside this enormously complicated but self-supporting ecological system. We conceptually cannot continue to think of ourselves as individuals who are moving across the world and acting on the world as agents that are different from the rest of reality. It's a very difficult idea for us to capture And we find it very difficult philosophically because we are so used to thinking of ourselves as occupying a space somewhere inside our heads, looking out on the world that's around us. In fact, we're very much inside this world, and we are simply an element of the wider reality that is thinking. But we are all there together in the initial evolutionary moments of the universe, the creation of the earth, and the creation of biological life. We are made up of all of these features and are an integrated part of it. So essentially, the cultural movement towards sustainability is about helping, particularly Western humans, to return home, to come home to the earth, and to recognize that they are part of that wider earth and are an element of it and are not distinct from it or different from it, and certainly not above it. Despite what we think, the planet and the earth comes first and is stronger than us, and is currently creating conditions on its surface that are going to be quite hostile to continued human existence on the planet. That is not good. And that hostility to us being on the planet is really the result of our own actions, by what we have done in terms of impacting on the natural processes of the earth. Now, let me give you a final example of the conceptual jump that we have to make. Most people are familiar with the idea that Galileo, the famous Italian astronomer, through his telescope, was able to show that, in fact, the Earth moved around the sun rather than the sun moving around the Earth. And that was a huge shock in the medieval world, because up until the Middle Ages, everyone pretty much believed that the Earth was at the center of the universe and everything went around the Earth. So Galileo was able to show that, in fact, the Earth was moving. Now, famously, he was brought in for questioning by the Inquisition, was silenced, was placed under house arrest, and had to withdraw his theory. But of course, it is said that as he was leaving his meeting with the Inquisition, he whispered to the people beside him, referring to the earth, and said, "And yet it moves." In other words, whether you believe it or not, or understand it or not, the reality is the earth does move. So you may arrest me and suppress me, it doesn't matter. This is reality. And yet it moves. The earth will move anyway. Now, we sometimes think that the Inquisition were really bad people and very primitive and so on. They weren't. They were just caught within the thinking available to them. And they just couldn't think outside those categories. To them, it was simply impossible that the earth was moving. They didn't feel it to be moving. No one had ever written down any account of it moving. The biblical story, as they understood it, seemed to suggest that the earth was at the center. So it was just beyond them. So one of the best known social theorists of our time, Bruno Latour, has given a slight variation on this story to explain the predicament that we are in now. And he says, when thinking of the earth, do you think it's meaningful to say at this point that the earth is moved? By which he means that the earth is so distressed by the damage being done that it is moved in such a way that is now acting to correct this problem. Now, again, for those who within a humanist, scientific, and anthropocentric worldview, the notion that the earth is moved is completely conceptually beyond us. It does not make sense to use that kind of language. We don't think of the earth in those terms. And yet, as Galileo said, it is moved. And it's moved because the earth is now acting independently of human control. And we can't stop it. So it's in this sense that we've entered into a whole new philosophical world where the human being is not the only agent determining what is happening, both at the level of chemistry and biology and physics, but also at the level of history. Human beings are not the author of history. From this point on, we are going to be reacting to what the earth is doing and trying to survive as best we can. The cultural challenge of sustainability is for us to leave aside our old ideas of humanism and anthropocentrism and embrace a whole new reality where we have to dialogue with the earth to understand it so that we can adjust to it and live with it as partners. Because if we don't understand how to do this, then no amount of tinkering at the edges of our system is going to suffice. We're just going to keep creating more and more problems because we won't understand the full impacts of the decisions we are making. So we either get to understand the earth as a whole, natural system. It's not suggesting the earth has some brain, it doesn't, but as an integrated system of feedbacks and responses and so on, we either come to understand that and fit in with it, or we simply ultimately will not survive. That's the cultural challenge of sustainability. I hope that's of help. I hope the reading is of help, and I hope you enjoy the whole program. Thank you.